All right, let me go ahead and we'll get started. So this is Dave Simons on creating digital negatives.
Easy Digital Negatives by Dave Simons. Why a digital negative? The only option for oil prints other than large format. These days I shoot mostly digital and only use film for pinhole photography. Even then, the negative is digitised. A DigiNeg allows me to dodge and burn down to pixel level if necessary, far more accurately than when working with a conventional negative and enlarger. It's way cheaper and far less time consuming than film photography. Far less wastage of precious paper because the digital negative is as near perfect as possible. I even digitise film negatives and adjust in computer for this very reason. An example of digital negative efficacy: I made 2 panels of 20 prints each. Out of the 40 prints I had 1 failure, and this was only due to lack of concentration on my behalf when I placed the negative the wrong way round in the printing frame. Digital negatives for Bromoil and oil contact printing. My method is by no means scientific. It's a simple no-frills approach which works for me. No extensive tests, no curves, just brightness and contrast adjustments, plus a known good negative to be used as an on-screen comparison. If you require a more scientific approach, see George L. Smythe's Creating the Digital Negative. Firstly, a red ink or a black ink negative. Red ink negs seem to produce better mid-tones. They're easy to use with single graded papers. Variable contrast papers can be problematical though. Black ink negs allow more efficient use of VC filters. And finally, most of the suitable papers available are variable contrast. People wishing to use digital negatives should first of all have a working knowledge of Photoshop. Here is a précis of the steps. Dodge, burn, clone, and adjust your image as necessary. Size the image now if you are not using borders. If using borders, make them now and then size the image. Make the brightness and contrast adjustments. Now invert the image. Flip the image horizontally. When making the darkroom print, the negative is flipped so the printed side is next to the photographic paper, ensuring the thickness of the acetate is out of the equation. Red neg only, colorise. Now we print the acetate. A printed border allows inking of the Bromoil print without the need to tape it down. No removing and replacing tape when resoaking. Other considerations: the negative. George Smythe uses a different coloured negative for each different paper he uses. This means producing a bespoke adjustment curve and colour profile for each different paper, a time-consuming operation. It is, however, worth producing a custom curve and bespoke negative if you have a large quantity of a specific paper or you prepare your own paper for oil printing. At the moment I have around 12 plus different papers that are suitable for Bromoil, but no great quantities of each. It's therefore too labour intensive for me to produce 12 different bespoke curves, and life's too short. Other considerations: exposure method. For oil prints, I use an Osram Ultra Vitalux UV lamp. Some people use UV flycatcher tubes, others the sun, and others Northlight daylight. There are now some excellent UV floodlights on the market, quite high powered. You just need to diffuse them down a little bit to stop high spots from the LEDs. For Bromoil contact printing, I use the focused light from an enlarger housing a 75 watt Philips photocrescenter lamp. And so to the brightness contrast method. For this exercise I'm using Photoshop CS5. The subject image has been uploaded, the borders have been applied, and the image has been sized to take into account the borders. I use a black inner of 2 mm thick and a white outer of 4 mm thick. Firstly, we go Image, Adjustments, Brightness, Contrast, and the Brightness Contrast box will appear below. You will note there are two sliders, one for brightness, one for contrast, both set halfway along at 0. We now move the contrast slider only to the left to -50 and then click OK. The box will close. We then need to reopen the box again for the further adjustments. When the box is opened again, we move the brightness slider to the left to -25 and also the contrast slider to the left to -25, and then we click OK. The image has now been reduced in contrast and darkened, so we now need to invert the image to make it into a negative. So we go Image, Adjustments, Invert. Our black ink negative is now complete. We just need to open a known good negative and do an eyeball comparison. We now have the mono negative and the imported known good negative for comparison purposes. Highlights and shadows and midtones all look okay, so we're good to go to the next stage. Now we flip the negative horizontally. We go Image, Image Rotation, Flip Canvas Horizontal. This is to ensure that the printed side of the acetate is directly against the emulsion side of the photographic paper, leaving no space of acetate. This ensures maximum sharpness. The black ink negative is now ready and can be printed. The settings I use for a Canon printer are photo printing, black and white photo paper. The OHP acetate is by PPD in the UK. Some additional steps are required for a red ink negative. Firstly, you need to ensure you're in RGB colour mode by going Image, Mode, RGB Colour. Firstly, we will see two boxes, one above the other, at the lower end of the tool menu. We click the upper box, and this will in turn bring up the colour picker menu. The foreground colour picker menu has now appeared. We need to input 255 into the box R, 0 into box G, and 0 into box B. Then we click OK. We now need to colorise the image, so we go Edit to Fill, and the fill box will appear. We need to set the boxes as follows. Use should be set as foreground colour. If it doesn't show that, click the downward pointing arrow and select it. Below that you'll see Blending and Mode. In the Mode box, select Colour. If that doesn't appear there, click the downward pointing arrow and select Colour. The opacity should be set at 100%. Now click OK. The red ink negative has now been colorised and is complete and ready for the eyeball comparison. As we did with the black ink negative, we open a known good negative and compare the two. And again, everything looks okay here, so we are good to go. We're now ready to print. The settings I use for a Canon printer are photo printing, photo glossy paper. The OHP acetate is again by PPD in the UK. Now let's look at possible problems. In this instance, the negative is too dense. Conversely, it may be too thin. The correction is the same for both problems. Namely, adjust using the levels central slider and compare with your known good negative. Clearly, our known good negative tells us that our test neg is blocked up, so we need to take remedial action. We first of all go Image, Adjustments, Levels to bring up the Levels function. The Levels box has now appeared. We now move the central slider below the histogram until the density of the negative is as near to the known good negative as possible. The slider has been adjusted and the neg is now nearer to the density of the known good neg. We now do our final eyeball comparison and everything looks good, so we are now good to print. There are of course some images that are way too contrasty, like this infrared capture on the left. The image requires adjustment in the sky areas in order to have the tree trunks stand out against the dark sky. Just looking at this digital neg on screen tells me there will be contrast problems. Some more work is needed in Photoshop before doing the brightness contrast conversion. Here we can see the amended positive and negative on the top, and below the old positive and the old negative. Instead of going through all the steps each time you wish to make a digital negative, simply record and save an action. In future, one click and it's done. If you wish to try this one, I'll make it available to download. And here is the Photoshop action. The full action will produce a red ink negative, complete the 3 brightness contrast adjustments, the inversion, the flip and the colorization. For a black ink negative, simply untick the last 3 boxes as shown above. Borders can be also included in the action, but this depends on print size and personal preference, so I've not included them in the current actions. So here we have the completed print and negatives. Firstly, the silver print, then the red ink negative, the black ink negative, and finally the completed Bromoil print. The completed Bromoil print now mounted. The Photoshop action for producing the negatives and a PDF version of this video will be available on the Bromoil and Oil Facebook page. If you've managed to get to the end of this video without falling asleep, thanks for watching and listening.
All right. Awesome. Let me see here. Thanks, Dave. That was great, man. So
No,
yeah,
it's totally out of sync, Austin. When I sent that through, yeah, absolutely, totally out of sync. It was stuck on certain images. Now, when I made it, it was absolutely spot on. So I don't know whether the software there is just beggaring everything up.
oh shit, sorry. Yeah, I still run into issues with it glitching up on me, even whenever I run everything optimized as much as I can. But you could hear the audio.
The audio was fine, but the actual it didn't make sense because the imagery was lagging behind. I mean, that when that finished, there was probably another 2 minutes, 3 minutes of visuals that should have come up.
Oh wow.
It worked fine in my end, Austin.
Did it?
Yeah, it worked fine for me as well. Maybe it's just your end, Dave.
Did you?
Yeah, I thought.
Did you actually see through to?
What was your question?
Did you
Dave?
actually see the?
It was, sorry, it was fine for me.
We saw the mounted Bromoil, Dave.
Well, you saw the mounted Bromoil. That's fine. It must be my end then that's
Yeah.
lagging.
So yeah, well, would love to open it up to any questions. That was a lot of information to digest, and I'm going to post both the PDF and the I don't know what would you call that, Dave? It's like the short code or the for the action, the Photoshop action. I'll post that in the chat right now, so that y'all can see it, and then I'll also add it into the Bromoil group later.
So
Dave,
I've got
I
a
had
nitpicking question here.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Tony.
Okay, very quick one. Dave, I've toyed with the idea of doing digital negatives over a number of years because I'm exclusively just in the darkroom now. And something that's always put me off has been the fact that printers are still pretty difficult to manage if you don't have a sufficient flow of prints going through them. The nozzles get dried out, and then you have to clean them. And I've always had problems with printers, put it that way. So it's always sort of put me off.
Have you always had Epson?
I've
Have you
always had
always had
problems
Epson
with
printers?
And also I've had, and when you sort of go into some of the detail about making digital negatives, you're sort of led by certain people to fairly expensive software and fairly expensive sets of ink and so on. And it's always put me off. But just seeing yours, it looks really, really simple and actually quite cheap, I thought.
Yeah, I think the thing is, sorry, I was just going to say the thing is with printers blocking up. I found this specifically with Epson printers. The same can't be said of the Canon printers. I've found I can leave those for weeks and they don't block up the jets or anything like that. They're fine. So I think it depends on your printer. And I think David Lewis made this point a few videos ago that he's got a Canon and he don't block up, whereas his Epsom's always used to. So I think that's a bit of a print problem there.
Right. Okay. Interesting.
So Tony, you digital printers may say something about this, but I've started doing digital printing from digital negs from 35mm color slides. And I'm making my digital negs from a little $75 desktop Hewlett Packard printer. And they seem to be working just fine.
Wow.
As long as you make sure you print them out at the best quality. And that in my case, my scans are very high resolution scans that I'm doing as well. So I'm getting a good file to work with to start with, as good as it can be, relatively speaking. So, but I don't have expensive. I did buy an Epson scanner, a V600 scanner to scan the slides, but I'm just using my little desktop printer for digital negs, and it seems to work just fine.
Nice.
Yeah, I don't think you have to have the most expensive printers. It's just a case of when you find one that's right for the job. And I found with the Epsoms, as I say, they do tend to clog up a little bit. But yeah, I mean, if you're getting your results with a cheap printer, that's all well and good. I won't buy another expensive one if I live that long enough that my current one fails.
Megan, Megan, you have a question there?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a clarification because I just went through this. I have to use digital negatives for a photogravure process that I'm taking. Even when I do from film, I need it as an intermediary step to contact print 35mm or 4x5 negatives. And after a lot of experimentation, well, just on the printing settings, but one thing I just wanted to say is that it's not necessarily maybe about the Epson versus Canon. The problem about the nozzles clogging is about the ink. With Epson and Canon, you can get dye-based ink or pigment-based ink, and the pigment is archival. But like I do have a pigment printer, But it is my responsibility to make sure that I turn it on once a week so it shakes up those cartridges. It's my responsibility to make sure that I print out even a test page every couple of weeks, because if they get clogged, it is an expensive fix. But the dye-based inks, which are available in Canon or Epson or other competitors, they don't clog the same way, because the fundamentals of the ink is just different. It comes out differently and it doesn't clog. And so you can leave them a lot longer. So I would say maybe just to not, I guess, be stuck on a brand thing. It's like the model itself and whether it fits in that pigment ink category for its output or it's dye-based ink for the output. That's a really big difference. And that was explained to me by multiple people when I was deciding which printer to get myself for digital. But I think what Dan just mentioned, in a lot of the groups that I'm in for Alt Process, a lot of people are getting great results out of, not expensive pigment printers. They're getting great results out of dye-based print. The negative might be less dense, but they just maybe adjust their exposure or adjust something else in the process to offset that. So instead of dumping an extra couple $100 in a pigment printer, if they're just using it for contact prints or digital negatives, they are just adjusting maybe something a little bit differently than I am with a pigment printer. But anyway, I just wanted to share that just because it's seemed like a really important point when I was buying my printer, and specifically for digital negatives.
And what I personally have done with the few digital negatives, because of the fact that I have to be selective on where I spend my money, is I found a local print shop, and they have specific, because I was recommended by David Lewis to use glossy paper specifically for the negatives, and so it cost me a couple of bucks and they print it out for me based on my specs and I just go pick it up. So instead of me having to drop $1,000 on a printer, I can spend that on the ridiculously overpriced film and paper that we use for everything else. But that's been my fix, because I just didn't want to buy it, and because I knew that I wouldn't be printing that often. So I didn't, and I was reading all these issues about the clogging, and I'm like, well, if I'm only doing this 2 or 3 times a year, it's worth me dropping 10 or 15 bucks a few times a year as opposed to maintaining this machine. Cool. Any other questions before we move on to Dan's presentation on liquid emulsion?
I'll drop in the chat. There's a digital negatives for contact printing group, dedicated group on Facebook, and there's a lot of interesting information on that. So I'll drop the name of it in the chat in case anyone's interested. I think they cover basically just the whole group is dedicated to digital negatives, regardless of process. So there's a lot of different processes going on in there, which like Dave mentioned in the presentation, you need to be really specific around how you're editing for your process. But anyway, I found a lot of interesting information in there. Recently, I just switched between Pictorico and InkPress media, so just different transparencies. And I found somebody had already done a conversion in there about the extra, 10 light units I need to do on one light unit, or the extra 17% longer exposure, just in the difference of the opacity of these two products. And sometimes people, I don't know in your countries, but I know here in Canada, people are switching between InkPress and Pictorico and another brand due to the increase in prices. And when you can keep everything else the same, but just that tiny little bit of opacity on the acetate can change, I guess, like how much, you're changing your exposure. So anyway, I found just some great information on that Facebook page for digital negatives like that. So I'll share it in the chat in case anyone's interested.
Awesome. Thank you. And actually that brings up one question I do have, Dave. So when I first started looking into digital negatives, I was looking at Pictorico and these other transparency types of materials. And then once again, reached out to David Lewis, and he's like, I don't do that. I just print it straight on paper. So in any opinion on the difference between printing, creating the digital negative on paper as opposed to some type of transparency material?
No, I've never tried the paper method. I've always used transparency because I use it for other things as well. I use it for the photogravure processes and also for inkjet alcohol gel transfers. So as far as the paper's concerned, I've never bothered with it for actually negatives.
Interesting. Megan, have you ever done paper?
No, but I know for another alt process, there's another artist at the print shop that I work with that does a lot of paper, but she oils the paper to make it transparent later. So a little bit different, but I personally haven't. No.
So Austin, when I started trying to get into this, because I'm a real beginner at this, I found a comparison video, YouTube video, where a photographer compared the Pictorico versus this from Fixins. Okay. This is called Fixins Waterproof Screen Positive Film.
Like a southern name, Fixins.
It's about a third the cost of Pictorico. Okay.
Oh, nice.
And the photographer did a comparison, making digital negatives from each of the different film types and then making a silver print from each of them. Basically, he said you can't really tell much of a difference between the two. So I don't know if you need to go to the extra cost to go to the Pictorico film or not.
Yeah.
Bought a 100 sheet package of this stuff for like $25 or something like that. So
yeah, and I mean, the few that I've done with the paper negatives, it came out great.
did they?
Yeah,
Okay.
and I didn't oil the paper or do any wax or anything like that. It just it's a 30-second exposure, and it works great. The main thing is just finding paper that doesn't have any type of watermark on the back of the paper. So when I went to that print shop, they printed them out. I came and picked it up. It wasn't something I'd thought about. And I was like, oh man, this has got a watermark on the back of it. This isn't going to work for what I need. So we had to find non-watermarked paper. So in the States, we have Costco, and supposedly the Kirkland brand of paper, they make a glossy paper with no watermark on it. If that's something anyone wants to experiment with.